It started with rain, the kind that doesn't fall but crashes heavy and relentless, slamming against the windows like something trying to get in or something trying to force me out. And I remember standing in the doorway of our kitchen at 11 years old, holding a crumpled permission slip in my hand, thinking about a field trip that cost $3. Just $3. And how I had practiced all afternoon what I was going to say, so my mother would sign it without getting irritated. Without that look she had that made everything inside me go quiet, but when I walked in, she wasn't looking at me. She was on the phone, her voice flat and calm, in a way that didn't match the storm outside, saying words I didn't understand at first. "It's done," she said. "She's leaving tonight," and I stood there frozen because I didn't know who she was talking about. I didn't know she meant me not yet. Not until she hung up, turned her head slowly, and looked at me like I wasn't her daughter but something inconvenient, something that had overstayed its place in her house. And then she said it, just 2 words that didn't feel real at first: "Pack up." And I remember actually smiling, thinking she meant for the trip, thinking maybe she was in a good mood, maybe tonight would be normal. But she didn't smile back. She didn't soften. She just repeated herself slower, this time sharper: "You're leaving tonight." And something inside me dropped like missing a step in the dark, like my body understood before my mind could catch up. And behind her, at the top of the stairs, my older brother stood, watching, leaning against the railing, arms folded, not confused, not surprised, just watching, like he already knew how this would end. Like this was something already decided, already planned, and I looked at him hoping for something, anything, a word, a question, a protest, but he said nothing. He didn't move. He just stayed there while my mother walked past me, opened the front door, and the sound of the rain filled the house instantly, loud and cold and final, and she grabbed a black garbage bag from under the sink, the kind used for yard waste, the kind that tore if you put too much in it, and shoved it into my hands. And I can still feel the plastic against my fingers, thin and crinkling, not meant for something like this, not meant for someone's life. And then she said 4 words I will hear for the rest of my life: "Go. Don't come back." Just like that. No explanation, no anger, no shouting, which somehow made it worse, because if she had yelled, maybe I could have believed it was a moment, a mistake, something that could be taken back, but she was calm, certain, already done with me. And I stood there for a second too long, waiting for her to change her mind, waiting for her to say my name, but she didn't. She just stepped aside from the doorway, letting the rain take up the space where I used to belong, and I stepped outside because I didn't know what else to do. Because when you're 11 and your mother tells you to leave, you don't argue, you don't negotiate, you just go. And the cold hit me immediately, soaking through my clothes in seconds, the garbage bag slipping in my hands as I tried to hold it closed. And I remember turning once, just once, looking back at the house, expecting the door to open, expecting someone to call me back, but the door closed instead, quietly, like the end of something that had already been decided long before I understood it, and I started walking, because standing there felt worse. Because staying meant accepting that I didn't belong, and the streetlights blurred through the rain as it soaked into my shoes, my socks, my skin, and everything felt heavy, slower, like I was moving through water, and I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. And somewhere along the way, the bag tore just a small rip, at first then bigger, until one of my books slipped out and landed in a puddle, the pages soaking instantly ink, bleeding into the water. And I stared at it for a second, thinking I should pick it up, thinking it mattered. But I didn't, because something in me already knew that nothing I carried from that house was coming with me, the same way nothing was intact anymore. Not the book, not the bag, not me. And I kept walking step after step, the rain numbing my hands, my face, my thoughts, until the only thing left was the sound of it hitting the ground and the feeling of being completely, absolutely alone. And I didn't cry, not then, because I think some part of me was still waiting to wake up, still believing this was something temporary, something that would be fixed in the morning, that someone would come find me, that this couldn't be how a family ends. Not like this. Not with a garbage bag and a door closing behind you. But no one came, and the rain didn't stop, and the road kept stretching forward into the dark, and for the first time in my life, I understood something I had never had to understand before. That home isn't a place you lose slowly. It's something that can disappear in a single moment, in a single sentence, in 4 words spoken without hesitation, and once it's gone, you don't get to go back and ask why. You just keep walking. Even if you don't know where you're going, even if every step feels like it's taking you further away from the only life you've ever known. For the next 21 years, it was as if I had never existed in that house at all, as if the girl who stood in the rain with a torn garbage bag had been quietly erased the moment the door closed behind her. And what shocked me most wasn't just the silence, but how complete it was, how absolute. Because I kept waiting at first, waiting for something that would prove I still belonged. Somewhere in their world, a phone call, a message, even anger would have been something, but there was nothing. No birthday cards, no holidays, no, "Are you okay?" Not even curiosity. And as the months turned into years, I started to understand that this wasn't distance, it wasn't conflict, it was removal, like I had been deleted from a story that kept going without me. And what made it harder was that life around me didn't stop. It kept moving forward in small, ordinary ways that highlighted just how absent I was from theirs, because I would hear about neighbors who still visited, about community events they attended, about my brother growing older, building a life, being seen, being acknowledged, while I existed somewhere outside that frame, not included, not mentioned, not even defended when people asked questions, because I later learned they had answers ready for those questions. Neat and simple ones that made everything easier for them, that I had left on my own, that I was difficult, that I didn't want to be part of the family anymore. And those stories spread quietly, comfortably, because they were easier to accept than the truth, and I wasn't there to contradict them. I wasn't there at all. And over time, that absence started to shape me in ways I didn't fully understand until much later, because when you grow up knowing that the people who are supposed to remember, you can choose not to, you start to question your own reality. You start to wonder if maybe you imagined parts of it, if maybe you were never as important as you thought, if maybe being forgotten is just another version of being replaced. And there were moments, small, unexpected ones, where that feeling hit the hardest, like walking past a family in a grocery store and watching a mother reach out to fix her child's places, call her without thinking or hearing, someone complain about their parents calling too often, and realizing you would have given anything for even one call, even one interruption that said you still mattered somewhere, but the silence stayed consistent, unwavering year after year. And consistency like that does something to you. It teaches you not to expect, not to hope, not to look back, because looking back only reminds you that there's nothing there waiting for you. And I learned to live forward, to build something from what was in front of me instead of what was behind me. But that didn't mean the absence disappeared. It just changed shape. It became quieter, more internal, something you carry instead of something you react to. And there were milestones I reached, completely alone moments that should have been shared, celebrated, witnessed, but weren't, like the first time I succeeded at something that mattered to me, and instinctively reached for my phone before realizing there was no one to call, no number that would lead to pride or support or even recognition. And that realization came again and again in different forms, until it stopped surprising me and started defining me. Because when no one is watching your life unfold, you begin to live it differently, more carefully, more independently, but also more guarded, like you're constantly aware that everything you build exists, without roots, without history, without anyone. Who remembers where you started? And I think the hardest part wasn't just that they cut me off, it was how easily they did it. How cleanly they continued without leaving any trace of hesitation, because it told me something I didn't want to believe, that forgetting me wasn't a struggle for them. It was a decision they made and then lived with comfortably. And that kind of realization doesn't break you all at once, it wears you down, slowly reshaping the way you see yourself and the world around you, until one day you realize you've adapted to it completely, that you've built a life where being alone isn't temporary. It's normal, where not being remembered isn't painful in the same sharp way anymore. It's just expected, and yet even after all those years, even after learning to exist without them, there was always a small part of me that remained aware of that absence, not loud, not demanding, just there like a space. That never quite feels a reminder that somewhere out there is a version of your life that continued without you, a version where your name isn't spoken, your presence isn't missed, and your story was quietly rewritten without your permission, and you don't get to correct it because you're no longer part of it, you're just the person who used to be. If there was one thing that kept me from completely disappearing during those years, it was my grandfather, because while the rest of my family erased me, he did the opposite. He anchored me in a quiet, steady way that didn't demand attention, but never let me drift too far from something solid, and I didn't understand it at the time, not fully. Because when you're young, you think protection looks loud, like someone stepping in, raising their voice, fixing everything in front of you. But my grandfather protected differently. He built things in the background piece by piece, the way he fixed old clocks in his workshop, patient and precise, making sure everything aligned, even if no one else could see how it worked, and our house became the one place where I didn't feel like I had to prove anything, where I wasn't the girl who had been sent away. I was just there sitting at the kitchen table while he drank his coffee, listening to the quiet rhythm of a life that didn't question my presence. And yet, even in that calm, there were moments that hinted at something deeper, something he wasn't saying outright, like the way he would pause sometimes when I asked about my parents, not avoiding the question but choosing his words carefully, as if he knew the truth had edges that could cut if handled too quickly. And instead of explaining everything, he would say things that didn't make sense then, but stayed with me long after, like the afternoon I was crying in the garage, because someone at school had asked why my mother never showed up to anything, and he set down his tools, looked at me with that steady, knowing expression, and said, "Someday, you'll understand why I'm saving the best for you." And I remember being confused, even a little frustrated, because I didn't want something saved for later. I wanted answers then. I wanted to know why my life looked the way it did while everyone else's seemed so simple. But he didn't explain. He just went back to his work as if the explanation itself was something that had to wait for the right moment. There were other signs, 2 small ones that felt ordinary at the time, but now I see were anything but like the man in the gray suit who would come by every few months, always at the same time, always staying just long enough to have a quiet conversation behind a closed door, their voices low, deliberate, never raised. And when I asked who he was, my grandfather would smile in that calm way of his and say, "An old friend helping with paperwork," which sounded harmless enough, but there was something about the way he said it that made me feel like the truth was larger than the words he chose, like paperwork was standing in for something more important, something structured and intentional. And I noticed the way he kept certain things separate from the rest of the house, like the locked oak box on the top shelf of his closet, the one he never opened in front of me, the one he reached for only when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and I asked him about it. Once standing in the doorway while he adjusted something inside, and he closed the lid gently and said, "That's your future," not joking, not exaggerating, just stating it like a fact. And I laughed because I didn't know what else to do with that kind of answer. But he didn't laugh back. He just looked at me for a second longer than usual, like he was making sure I remembered that, a moment like he was planting something that would only make sense later. And that was how he was with everything. Not dramatic, not obvious, but always intentional, always a step ahead in a way that felt protective without being controlling. And even when life got harder, when my grandmother passed and the house grew quieter, when I started thinking about leaving for college and building something beyond the small world, I knew he stayed consistent, driving me to campus visits, helping me edit essays, never pushing, but always present, as if he understood that the best way to support me wasn't to decide my path, but to make sure I had one. And looking back now, I realize he wasn't just helping me prepare for a future, he was preparing that future itself. Laying down pieces I couldn't see yet, making arrangements I wouldn't understand until much later, and when he died peacefully without warning, it felt like losing the last person who truly knew me, the last connection to something stable. And I thought that whatever he had meant by those things he said, whatever he had been saving, had disappeared with him, because there was no explanation, no immediate revelation, just the same quiet absence that had defined so much of my life. And yet even then, even in that moment, there were signs that his plan hadn't ended, like the appearance of the man in the gray suit at the funeral, the same man I had seen so many times before stepping forward, not as a stranger, but as someone who had been waiting for the right moment, introducing the seven in LA himself, as my grandfather's attorney, handing me a sealed envelope with the same careful precision my grandfather had used in everything he did, telling me the time wasn't right yet, but that it would be. And I remember holding that envelope, feeling its weight in a way that didn't match its size, sensing that it contained something more than just paper, something that connected all those quiet moments, all those unfinished explanations, all those hints my grandfather had left behind. And even though I didn't open it, then, even though I carried it with me for years, without fully understanding why, there was a part of me that knew it mattered, that whatever he had been building, whatever he had been protecting, hadn't disappeared at all. It had just been waiting, just like he said it would, for the moment when everything else would finally make sense. I didn't call it strength at the time, and I definitely didn't call it ambition, because ambition implies a choice, a direction you actively pursue, but what I was doing felt more like movement, without permission, like I had been, pushed so far outside the life I was supposed to have that the only option left was forward, one step at a time, even when I didn't know where those steps would lead, and college became the first real place where that movement turned into something structured, something that felt like it could belong to me, even if I had to build it entirely on my own, because there was no family to fall back on, no safety net, no one checking in to see if I was okay, which meant every decision carried weight in the way I hadn't experienced before. Every class, every job, every late night studying or working wasn't just about progress, it was about survival, about proving to myself that I could exist without the version of me they had erased. And I remember sitting in small crowded spaces with other students who talked casually about going home for the weekend, about parents who worried or complained or supported them in ways that felt foreign to me, and instead of feeling jealous, I felt distant, like I was observing a life that operated on rules I no longer understood. Because for me, there was no home to return to, only the next task, the next deadline, the next step forward. And that difference shaped everything about how I approached my future. Because I didn't have the luxury of drifting, of figuring things out slowly. I had to be deliberate, focused, consistent, and over time that focus turned into something else, something sharper, more defined. And when I graduated, it wasn't with the kind of celebration people imagine. There was no one in the audience looking for me, no one waiting afterward with flowers or congratulations. But there was something else instead, a quiet sense that I had crossed a line on my own, that I had taken everything that was supposed to limit me and moved past it anyway, and that feeling didn't fade. It followed me into the next phase of my life, when I moved to a new city with almost nothing, carrying everything I owned in a single bag, and every expectation resting entirely on my own shoulders. And the early years were exactly what you'd expect: long hours, small spaces, constant uncertainty, working jobs that paid just enough to keep going while trying to build something more stable in the background. And there were moments where it felt like I was barely holding everything together, where exhaustion blurred into routine, and routine blurred into something that felt permanent. But underneath all of that, there was a steady momentum, the kind that doesn't rely on motivation or inspiration, but on consistency, on showing up even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching, because I had learned early on that recognition wasn't guaranteed, that effort didn't automatically lead to acknowledgement, so I stopped expecting it and started focusing on the work itself, on building something that didn't depend on anyone else's validation, and over time, that work began to take shape in ways I hadn't anticipated, because what started as survival slowly evolved into creation, into something that reflected not just where I had been, but where I wanted to go. And when I eventually started building my own company, it didn't feel like a dramatic turning point. It felt like a continuation of everything I had already been doing, just on a larger scale, more structured, more intentional. And the idea itself came from a place I knew well, the experience of being alone, of navigating life without guidance or support. And I realized there were others who understood that feeling, Others who had aged out of systems or situations without a clear path forward. And instead of trying to replicate what I had lost, I focused on creating something that could fill that gap for someone else, something practical, something real. And building that from the ground up required everything I had learned up to that point: the discipline, the resilience, the ability to keep going without immediate results. And there were setbacks, of course, moments where things didn't work the way I expected, where progress stalled or reversed, but those moments didn't stop me the way they might have before, because I had already experienced what it meant to lose everything, and compared to that, failure felt temporary, manageable, something that could be adjusted and overcome rather than something that defined me. And eventually the work began to speak for itself. Opportunities opened, partnerships formed, and what I had built started to gain recognition in ways I hadn't planned for, but was ready to handle. And on paper, it looked like success, measurable, visible, something that could be quantified and understood from the outside. But internally, it felt different, quieter, more grounded, because I knew exactly what it had taken to get there. I knew the absence that had shaped it, the isolation that had forced me to rely on myself. And that contrast became one of the most defining parts of my identity, the gap between the girl who had been pushed out into the rain with nothing and the person who now stood on her own, not because someone had given her a chance, but because she had built one step by step without waiting for permission, without expecting acknowledgement, just moving forward until forward became something solid, something real, something that no one could take away or rewrite. The call came at a time when my life finally felt steady. Not perfect, but stable, in a way I had built piece by piece without anyone's help. And maybe that's why it hit harder than it should have, because it didn't arrive in chaos or crisis. It arrived in calm, slipping into a moment that didn't ask for it, my phone lighting up with a number I didn't recognize, but somehow already knew before I even answered, because there are voices your body remembers, even when your mind tries to forget. And when I heard hers, older now, softer, almost fragile, it felt like something inside me tightened instantly, like a reflex I hadn't used in years. And she said my name the way people do when they're trying to sound careful, deliberate, as if choosing the right tone could rewrite everything that came before it. And for a few seconds, I didn't say anything, not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't know which version of myself was supposed to respond. The child who had been sent away without explanation, or the adult who had learned how to live without her, and she filled that silence quickly, apologizing in a way that sounded practiced, not insincere exactly, but too structured, too controlled, like she had rehearsed it enough times that it no longer to belong to a real moment. And she said she had changed, that she had been thinking about me, that time had given her perspective. All the things people say when they're trying to reopen a door, they close themselves. And then she introduced the reason for the call, slowly, carefully, as if it were something fragile that might break. If she said it too quickly, she had been diagnosed with cancer early stage, she said, emphasizing that part as if to balance urgency with hope. And I felt something shift when she said it, not sympathy exactly, but recognition, because illness changes the tone of any conversation. It reframes everything. It creates a sense of limited time, of things needing to be resolved before it's too late. And she leaned into that, whether consciously or not, saying she didn't know how much time she had, that she didn't want to leave things the way they were between us, that she wanted to me to talk, to try again. And the word family came up more than once, not defined, not explained, just repeated, as if saying it enough times could make it real again. And I stood there listening, holding the phone in a way that felt unfamiliar, because I hadn't had to hold that kind of conversation in years. And my thoughts moved in two directions at once. One part of me analyzing everything she said, the timing, the tone, the way the apology didn't quite match the history, the way the illness was positioned at the center of the request, and another part of me reacting in a way I didn't expect, quieter, less logical. The part that remembered what it felt like to want a mother, even after everything, even after 21 years of silence, because that kind of absence doesn't erase the idea completely. It just buries it, and now it was being pulled back to the surface without warning, and she continued saying she wanted us all to spend time together, that my brother wanted to apologize too, that they had been talking about it, thinking about how to make things right. And that phrase stayed with me, make things right, because it implied something balanced, something equal, when nothing about our past had been that way, and I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch again, not as a reaction this time, but as a way to create space between what she was saying and what I was feeling, because I knew if I answered too quickly it would come from the wrong place, from that buried part of me that still wanted something it shouldn't expect. And she interpreted the silence as hesitation, which it was, and she softened her voice further, adding details about a trip, a place, a setting that sounded intentionally neutral, a resort somewhere away from everything, somewhere we could start fresh, as if location could erase history, and I could hear the effort in her voice, the careful layering of reasons, the way she was building a case not just for meeting, but for believing her. And I realized then that this wasn't just an apology, it was an invitation and not a simple one. Because accepting it meant stepping back into something I had spent years moving away from, and declining it meant closing a door that had unexpectedly opened, maybe for the last time, depending on how real her situation was, and that uncertainty made the Breda's decision heavier, more complicated, because it wasn't just about trust, it was about timing, about whether I could risk reopening something that had already been closed so completely. And I thought about everything that had happened, the silence, the absence, the lack of accountability, and none of it aligned cleanly with the version of her I was hearing now, which made it harder to reconcile, harder to accept at face value. And yet there was that other part of me, still present, still listening, still asking questions that didn't have clear answers. What if she had changed? What if time had altered something fundamental? What if this was genuine? And I turned away from it without knowing, and I didn't like those questions, but I couldn't ignore them either, and by the time the call ended, I hadn't given her a clear answer, just something non-committal, something that left space for a decision I hadn't made yet. And after I hung up, I stayed where I was for a long time, phone still in my hand, replaying the conversation in my mind, not just what she said, but how she said it, looking for inconsistencies, for signs, for anything that would make the decision easier, but nothing stood out clearly enough to settle it, which meant the tension stayed exactly where it was unresolved, sitting between logic and emotion, between past and possibility, and for the first time in years, I found myself considering something I had trained myself not to consider at all, going back, even if only temporarily, even if only to see for myself whether what she was offering was real or just another version of something that had already hurt me once, and knowing that whatever I decided, it wouldn't be simple, it wouldn't be clean, it would carry consequences either way, because some doors once opened again don't close the same way twice. The resort was exactly the kind of place people choose when they want everything to look effortless, polished surfaces, soft lighting, carefully arranged smiles. And from the moment I walked into the lobby, I could feel how deliberate it all was, not just the setting, but the way they greeted me, my mother. Stepping forward with open arms, before I even had time to put my bag down, her voice breaking just enough to suggest emotion, without losing control, telling me how beautiful I looked. How much she had missed me, while my brother stood just behind her, with that practiced ease, extending his hand instead of embracing me as if we were business associates meeting for the first time, rather than siblings who shared a past neither of us was acknowledging. And I noticed immediately how everything was slightly off, not wrong in an obvious way, but misaligned in a way that made it hard to relax, because every word felt measured, every reaction slightly delayed, like they were performing a version of normal rather than living it. And I played along at first, not out of trust, but out of caution, because I needed to see where this was going before deciding how to respond. And the first evening passed with surface-level conversation, safe topics, stories that didn't require honesty. My mother talking about her routines, her health, carefully returning to the idea that she had changed, that time had given her clarity, while my brother shifted the focus in subtler ways, asking about my work, my schedule, how I manage things, questions that sounded casual but came too quickly, too specifically, like he was gathering information rather than making conversation. And I answered in general terms, enough to keep the exchange moving without giving anything away, because something about the rhythm of it felt wrong, like a script I hadn't been given. And as the night went on, the tension didn't fade. It just settled deeper, becoming less noticeable on the surface, but more present underneath. And by the second day, the pattern became clearer, the small inconsistencies adding up, the way my mother would redirect certain topics, the way my brother would circle back to others, especially anything related to finances, ownership, stability, questions framed as concern, but delivered with precision, asking if I was comfortable, if I had considered long-term planning, if I thought about family in terms of shared resources, and each time I deflected, keeping my answers vague, watching how they reacted, and each time there was a slight shift, a momentary tightening, quickly hidden but still there, and I started to feel like I was being evaluated, not welcomed like my Dane. Presence wasn't the goal, but a step towards something else. And that feeling grew stronger during moments that were supposed to feel genuine, like the photos on the beach, where my mother spoke loudly enough for others to hear, shaping the narrative in real time, presenting me as someone who had returned after years of distance, leaving out the part where I had never chosen to leave, and I stood there smiling, because correcting her in that moment would have changed nothing. It would have only exposed the performance for what it was, without altering the outcome. And by the third day, the tension had built to a point where it was no longer subtle. It was structured, intentional, and it came to a head at breakfast, where my brother arrived, carrying a folder, placing it on the table with an ease that felt rehearsed, as if this had always been the purpose of the trip, and the way he introduced it confirmed that, his tone casual but focused, explaining that he had been reviewing family matters, that there were assets, properties, things that needed to be organized, and he slid the document toward me, presenting it as something simple, something administrative, a way to bring everything together. And the language was careful, neutral on the surface, but loaded underneath, referencing a family trust, shared responsibility, long-term management, all framed as reasonable, even beneficial, and I ended up reading just enough to recognize what it actually was. Not a formality, but a transfer of control, a consolidation that would place authority in his hands, removing my ability to access or manage anything tied to that name. And I looked up, not reacting immediately, because reacting would have given them something to work with. And instead, I asked for time, calmly, directly, and the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, my brother leaning back slightly, repeating that it was straightforward, that there was nothing complicated about it, while my mother reached for my hand in a gesture that was meant to feel reassuring but felt calculated, instead reinforcing the idea that this was about trust, about family, about doing the right thing together. And I pulled my hand back, not dramatically, just enough to create space, repeating that I needed time to review it properly. And that was the moment everything underneath the surface became visible, not in frowment and words, but in expressions: the brief tightening of my brother's jaw, the slight change in my mother's posture, the performance slipping just enough to reveal the pressure behind it. And I realized then that this wasn't an invitation, it was a setup. The entire trip structured around this moment, the conversations, the tone, the setting, all leading here, and the tension that had been building finally had a clear shape, a purpose, and I understood that whatever came next would depend entirely on how I responded, not just to the document, but to everything it represented. The attempt to reestablish control under the appearance of reconciliation, the use of time and circumstance to create urgency, the layering of emotion over something fundamentally transactional, and sitting there at that table with the sound of waves just outside and the illusion of a peaceful setting around us. I felt the full weight of it, not just the decision in front of me, but the realization that nothing about this was accidental, that every detail had been designed to bring me to this exact point, where saying yes would give them everything they wanted, and saying no would expose what they had been trying to hide all along. The first message came in quietly, almost easy to ignore, just a line of text from an unknown number that appeared on my screen late in the evening after that breakfast. After the folder, after the moment, everything stopped pretending to be normal, and it said something simple but precise, something that didn't sound like a guess or a vague warning, but a direct observation. and I remember staring at it longer than I should have, reading it twice then a third time, because it didn't fit into anything I understood yet. It didn't match the version of events I was being shown in person, and my first instinct was to dismiss it, to assume it was a coincidence, spam, a wrong number, anything that would keep it from being real, because if it was real, then it meant someone else was watching. Someone else knew more than I did, and that idea was harder to process than the message itself. So I set the phone down, told myself it didn't matter, that I already had enough to think about. But the words stayed with me, not loud, not demanding, just present in the background of everything else. And when the second message came the next morning, it was harder to ignore because it wasn't general anymore. It was specific, referencing something that had happened at the table, something that confirmed whoever was sending these texts wasn't guessing they were seeing, and that shifted everything. Because now it wasn't a question of whether the message was real, it was a question of who was behind it and why. And I felt that tension rise again, sharper this time, because I was already on edge, already questioning what I was being told. And now there was a second layer, an external voice, contradicting the one in front of me. And I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. Because responding meant engaging with something I couldn't verify, something that might help or might make everything worse. And I had learned to be careful with uncertainty, especially when it came wrapped in urgency. And yet as the day went on, the messages continued, not constant, but timed, deliberate, each one adding a piece without revealing the whole, like someone guiding rather than explaining. And that made it more unsettling because it suggested intention planning, and I found myself checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit, waiting for the next message, even as I told myself I shouldn't trust it, and the internal conflict became louder, two lines of thought running at the same time, one grounded in logic, reminding me that I didn't know this person, that acting on anonymous information could be reckless, that I should rely on what I could verify directly, and the other, shaped by instinct, quieter but persistent, pointing out the inconsistencies I had already noticed, the way the trip felt constructed, the pressure around the documents, the questions that didn't align with reconciliation, and that second voice didn't need proof, it just needed pattern, and the pattern was there whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. And when the next message came, it wasn't a warning. It was a directive, clear, concise, telling me to leave. Not later, not after another conversation, but immediately, with specific instructions that removed the possibility of hesitation. And that was the moment everything narrowed, because the decision was no longer abstract. It was immediate: act or don't act, trust or don't trust. And I sat there in my room reading that message over and over, feeling the weight of it settle in a way that was different from everything before, because this wasn't about interpretation anymore. It was about consequence, about what would happen if I stayed versus what might happen if I left. And I thought about the last few days, replaying every detail, the tone of their voices, the timing of the document, the subtle pressure, the lack of genuine explanation. And then I thought about the messages, the accuracy, the timing, the fact that whoever was sending them had nothing to gain from me directly, at least not in any way I could. See? And that contrast became the deciding factor, not certainty, but alignment. One version of events felt controlled, constructed, designed to lead me somewhere specific, and the other felt disruptive, unexpected, not polished, but precise. And in that moment, precision mattered more than presentation, and I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, that I didn't trust the people I was, with not in the way that mattered, not enough to ignore a warning that might be real. And once that realization settled, the rest followed quickly, not easily, but clearly, because the decision to leave wasn't about confidence, it was about risk. And staying felt like a greater risk than going, even without knowing exactly what I was walking into. And I moved quickly after that, not rushing in a chaotic way, but with a kind of controlled urgency, packing only what I had brought, leaving everything else untouched, because I didn't want to create noise, didn't want to give them time to react. and I checked my phone one more time before stepping out half, expecting another message, another instruction, but there was nothing, just the last one still there, still clear, and I followed it step by step, leaving the room, moving through the quiet hallway, avoiding the main areas, taking the route that required the least interaction, because the goal wasn't confrontation, it was exit. And as I walked out of the building, the air felt different. Not safer exactly, but open in a way that allowed movement. And I didn't look back, not because I wasn't tempted to, but because I knew that looking back would slow me down, would create hesitation where I couldn't afford it. And by the time I reached the car, by the time I put distance between myself and that place, the decision had already solidified, not in the sense that everything made sense, but in the port, to sense that I had chosen a direction. And sometimes that's the only clarity you get in moments like that. Not certainty, but commitment. The understanding that whatever happens next, it will be based on a choice you made with the information you had. Incomplete as it was, and as I drove away, the messages, the tension, the questions didn't disappear, but they shifted from something that held me in place to something that pushed me forward, and for the first time since arriving, I felt like I was no longer reacting to a situation I didn't control. I was moving through it on my own terms, even if I didn't yet know where those terms would lead. The airport felt colder than it should have when I stepped into the arrivals hall, not because of the temperature, but because of the realization that I had just left something unresolved behind and walked directly into something I didn't yet understand. And when I saw the man holding a sign with my name, standing beside two uniformed officers who weren't threatening but weren't casual either, I knew immediately that whatever was about to happen wasn't random. It had been arranged, planned with the same kind of precision I had been sensing for days. And the man introduced himself calmly, his voice steady, familiar in a way that took a second to place until I recognized it from years earlier, from a different moment tied to a different version of my life. My grandfather's attorney, the same presence that had existed quietly in the background, before now stepping forward into something direct and unavoidable, and he didn't waste time on unnecessary details. Just asked me to follow him, guiding me into a private room where everything shifted from uncertainty into structure, where the questions I had been carrying began to align with something tangible, something documented, and when he placed the private room where lighting the tangible, and Sering wanted to be in. Materials on the table in front of me, each item positioned with deliberate care, I understood that this wasn't just a conversation, it was a reveal, the kind that changes not just what you know, but how you interpret everything that came before it. And he began with the most immediate fact, the one that reframed everything else that my grandfather had left. A will, not a vague or partial one, but a complete legally binding document that named me as the sole beneficiary of his estate. And for a moment the words didn't register fully, not because they were unclear, but because they conflicted so directly with what I had been told for years, that there was nothing, that everything had been handled, that I wasn't part of it. And now that narrative was being replaced with something entirely different, something that had been kept hidden, not by absence, but by design. And he continued explaining the scope of it, the house, the accounts, the investments accumulated over decades, the kind of stability my grandfather had built, quietly, while I was trying to build something of my own from nothing, and the numbers themselves felt abstract at first. Not because they were small, but because they were too large to connect immediately to anything real. And yet the weight of them settled quickly once I understood what they represented, not just financial value, but intention, proof that I had not been forgotten, that someone had not only remembered me, but planned for me in a way that extended far beyond his lifetime, and that realization created a kind of shock that wasn't loud or dramatic, but deep, because it challenged the version of my past I had learned to accept, replacing absence with presence, erasure, with deliberate preservation. And then came the second layer, the part that transformed the information from revelation into something more complex, more calculated, because the will hadn't been designed to take effect immediately. It had conditions, specific ones that had to be met before it could be executed, and he outlined them with the same calm precision. that I had to reach a certain age, that contact had to be initiated by my family, that certain events had to align before the process could begin. And as he explained this, the timeline started to make sense in a way that was both clarifying and unsettling, because it meant that everything that had just happened, the call, the invitation, the trip wasn't isolated, it was connected to something they had discovered, something they had been trying to access. And the timing was no longer coincidence, it was strategy. And that realization shifted the meaning of everything I had experienced over the past few days, turning what had felt like tension into confirmation, because the pressure, questions, the document they had presented, all of it aligned perfectly with the existence of this will, with the fact that I held something they needed but couldn't access directly. And the attorney paused briefly, not to create drama, but to give space for the information to settle, because it wasn't just a matter of understanding it intellectually, it was a matter of integrating it into a narrative that had just been fundamentally altered. And I sat there, processing it, feeling the initial shock give way to something more structured, a reorganization of cause and effect, of past and present, of what had been hidden and what was now being revealed. And I realized that this wasn't just a reward. It wasn't simply the unexpected benefit of something I had lost years ago. It was part of a larger design, something my grandfather had anticipated, something he had prepared for in advance, not just to provide for me, but to protect that provision from being taken or manipulated. And that added a layer of meaning that went beyond the material, because it spoke to his understanding of the people involved, to his awareness of how they might act if given the opportunity. And the conditions themselves reflected that awareness, creating a scenario where their actions would trigger the very mechanism they were trying to control. And that inversion was the twist, the part that transformed the situation from something reactive into something almost strategic, where the attempt to access the inheritance had instead activated it under terms they couldn't dictate. And as I absorbed all of this, the initial shock settled into clarity, not complete understanding, because there were still details to uncover, but enough to see the structure of what had been set in motion, enough to recognize that the situation I had just left behind was not only justified in my suspicion, but explained by something far more concrete, and that the path forward, whatever it would be, would now be shaped not just by what I had experienced, but by what had been revealed, by the fact that the story I had been told for years was incomplete, and that the truth, now that it had surfaced, was both a resolution and a beginning, something that answered questions while creating new ones, something that shifted the balance of control in a way that I had not expected but was now fully aware of. What came next didn't feel like a continuation of the story, so much as a rupture in it, a moment where everything that had been implied snapped into something undeniable, because after the will, after the explanation, after the realization that the trip had been orchestrated around access to something I didn't even know I had. I thought I understood the worst of it. I thought the deception ended at manipulation, at pressure, at control, disguised as reconciliation. But then the attorney opened the folder he had set aside. Until that moment, the one he had described only briefly, and the tone of the room shifted in a way that was immediate and unmistakable, because the information inside wasn't interpretive, it wasn't subjective, it was concrete, documented, time-stamped. And as he began to lay out the contents piece by piece, I felt something inside me go, still not calm, but suspended, like my mind was bracing for something it hadn't fully imagined yet. And the first page was a series of messages printed clearly organized in sequence, conversations between my brother and someone identified only by an initial, and at first they looked like logistics, fragments of planning, but the language sharpened quickly, moving from coordination to contingency and portents, then to something else entirely, something that made the air in the room feel thinner, because it wasn't about what they hoped would happen anymore. It was about what they were prepared to do if it didn't, and the phrase that stood out, the one that anchored everything else, was simple and direct. If she doesn't sign, we go to Plan B. And I remember reading it once, then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to confirm that I was reading it correctly, that there wasn't another interpretation hidden behind it, and there wasn't. And when I asked what Plan B referred to, The answer didn't come in speculation or theory. It came in additional evidence, more messages, more detail, outlining scenarios in a way that removed any ambiguity, references to locations, to methods, to outcomes that would appear accidental. Phrases like balcony pool, keep it clean, words that were casual in structure, but carried a weight that made them impossible to detach from their meaning, and I felt my body react before my thoughts fully caught up, a tightening in my chest. A drop in my stomach, not fear in the immediate sense, but something deeper, the recognition that the situation I had just left wasn't just unsafe in an abstract way, it had been actively dangerous in a way I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider, and I could feel the room narrowing, not physically, but perceptually, as if everything outside of that table, those documents, that moment had receded, leaving only the evidence in front of me and the realization of what it represented. And I stood up without fully deciding to moving toward the door, not to leave, but to create space to breathe, because the weight of it had shifted from external to internal, from something I was analyzing to something I was experiencing. And when I stepped into the hallway, the composure I had been holding on to fractured. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough that I had to stop, lean against the wall, close my eyes for a second longer than I intended. Because the narrative had just changed again, and this time it wasn't about understanding, it was about survival, about the fact that the people I had been sitting across from, speaking with, considering whether to trust, had already planned for a version of events where I didn't leave that place at all, where my absence would be explained rather than questioned. And that realization didn't just settle in, it reverberated, connecting backward through every interaction, every question. Every moment that had felt slightly off but hadn't crossed a clear line until now. And when I returned to the room, the next layer was already waiting, not just messages between my brother and the outside contact, but communication that included my mother, responses that confirmed awareness, approval, without direct involvement, language that distanced responsibility while enabling action. And seeing her words there in that context removed any remaining ambiguity, because it showed that this wasn't a singular decision, it was a shared understanding, a coordinated plan that extended beyond one person's desperation into something collective. And I felt something break at that point, not loudly, not visibly, but internally, a shift from questioning to certainty, from analysis to acceptance of what was in front of me, and the officers present in the room, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward in a way that was measured but decisive, explaining the steps that had already been taken, the coordination with local authorities where the plan had been set in motion, the monitoring that had allowed them to intervene before it escalated beyond intent into action, and the structure of it all, the legal process, the documentation, the sequence of events created a framework that was almost surreal in its clarity, because it transformed something deeply personal into something procedural, something that could be addressed, contained, acted upon. And that shift was what allowed me to move from reaction back into awareness, because the situation, while severe, was no longer undefined. It had boundaries, it had evidence, it had consequences already in motion, and I sat back down. Not because I felt steady, but because there was no other place to be, and listened as the final pieces were outlined, the arrests planned, the evidence secured, the path forward established in terms that were precise and actionable. And as the information settled, the emotional impact followed in waves, not overwhelming but persistent, a recognition of what could have happened, of how close I had been to something I hadn't fully seen, and the clarity that came with knowing I had left when I did that. The decision I had made without full information had aligned with a reality far more serious than I had allowed myself to consider, and in that moment, the story reached a point where it could no longer be interpreted as misunderstanding or coincidence. It had become something definitive, something that redefined the relationships involved and the actions that would follow, and sitting there and fist assenting with redefined the relationships involved. Surrounded by evidence, by structure, by the presence of people whose role was to enforce what had been uncovered, I understood that whatever came next would not be about uncovering the truth anymore. It would be about what that truth demanded in response. The end didn't come with a single moment of resolution, the way people imagine it. Does no dramatic confrontation in a room where everything is said and settled at once. It came in stages, quiet, procedural, almost clinical, but no less final because of it. And the first stage was the arrest, which I didn't witness in person, but understood through the clarity of the report that followed, the way it laid out the sequence of events with precision. The early morning knock on the door, the timing deliberate, chosen to minimize resistance and maximize control. My brother answering half awake, unaware that the plan he had constructed so carefully had already unraveled, that the messages he thought were contained had become evidence that the contingency he believed would remain hypothetical had triggered something real, and I pictured it as it was described, the officers identifying themselves reading the charges, the shift in his expression from confusion to comprehension, the realization setting in not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual recognition of consequence, because this wasn't something he could talk his way out of. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be reframed. It was documented, verified, already in motion, and I was told that my mother was there, that she appeared moments later, drawn by the disruption, reacting in a way that matched everything I had come to understand about her, not with admission but with deflection, not with clarity but with immediate repositioning, raising her voice, questioning the process, attempting to redirect attention away from what had been uncovered and toward the idea that something was being done to her rather than revealed about her. And that distinction mattered because it showed that even in that moment, even when the structure of her narrative had collapsed, her instinct was still to control perception, to reshape the situation into something that preserved her role as the victim. And that pattern continued when she called me, her voice no longer soft or careful, but sharp, urgent, demanding answers. She already had asking what I had done, why this was happening, framing the arrest as an action I had taken rather than a consequence of what had been planned. And for a moment I listened without interrupting, not because I was unsure of my response, but because I wanted to hear the full extent of it, the way she constructed her version of events. Even now, and when I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her intensity. I stated the facts as they had been presented to me, the messages, the plan, the involvement, not as accusations, but as confirmations. And there was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than any before, not silence, but absence. The space where her narrative didn't immediately fit, where the words she had prepared didn't align with the reality she was now facing. And when she responded, it wasn't with denial in the way I expected it, was with a shift, a purse's subtle attempt to redefine intent, to separate awareness from action, suggest that understanding something isn't the same as endorsing it, that her role had been misinterpreted, minimized, reframed in a way that might create doubt. And I recognized that pattern immediately because it was the same one she had used for years, the ability to adjust the story without addressing its core, to move the focus just enough to avoid direct accountability, and this time, for the first time, it didn't work. Not because I interrupted her, not because I argued, but because I didn't engage with it at all. I let the statements stand as they were without adding to them, without giving them space to expand. And I told her simply that the evidence existed independently of what either of us said, that the process was already in motion, and that whatever happened next would be determined by that, not by conversation. And that was the moment where something shifted, not in her but in me, because I realized I doubly wasn't waiting for anything from her anymore. Not an explanation, not an apology, not even acknowledgement. The need for that had dissolved somewhere between the evidence and the reality of what it represented, and when the call ended, it didn't feel abrupt or unfinished. It felt complete in a way that didn't require further discussion. And the days that followed reinforced that sense of closure, not through emotional resolution, but through structure, through the legal steps that continued without input from me, the hearings, the filings, the processes that translated what had been uncovered into consequences that didn't depend on interpretation. And I found that I didn't need to follow every detail. I didn't need to stay connected to each development because the outcome no longer defined me in the way it might have before it existed. As a result of actions taken by others, actions I had moved away from, and that distance created something unexpected, not relief exactly, but clarity. The kind that comes when you finally understand that the story you've been trying to resolve doesn't require your participation anymore, that its conclusion isn't something you have to shape or influence. It simply unfolds based on what is already there, and I thought about everything that had led to this point, the years of absence, the sudden return, the constructed reconciliation, the plan that had been hidden beneath it, and I realized that what I had been given in the end wasn't just the exposure of that plan, it was the removal of any remaining uncertainty about who they were and what they were capable of, and that clarity more than anything else was what allowed me to step forward without looking back, not because the past had been resolved in a way that made sense or felt fair, but because it had been revealed completely, leaving nothing else to question, nothing else to reinterpret, just a defined end to something that had been unresolved for far too long.